in the country. Next, we'll talk a little bit with panel 1, Dr. Megan Krupa, Dr. Pete Rand, and Dr. Krista. Okay. Krista, they're going to talk about the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project. Panel 2 is going to be myself, Mary Sattler-Patola, and Ben Stevens, and we're going to talk about the impacts from the statewide decline on king salmon across the state in different communities. And then we're also going to talk about compensated allocation, which is a market-based approach to fishery allocations when we have conservation difficulty with different species. And these two are going to be talking about salmon and halibut. So to get started, I'll allow our keynote speaker to just introduce yourself for a little bit, and then we'll go down the panel.
Hello, is this on?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Chris Oliver. I am the head of the National Marine Fisheries Service, otherwise known as the Noaa Assistant Administrator for Fisheries. And I've been in the position for just over a year now. And prior to going into that position, I spent the previous 27 years here in Alaska working for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the 30,000. I can assure you I'm not going to talk for 30 minutes, partly because I left all my notes on my kitchen table in Anchorage this morning, and partly because I know you don't want me to talk for 30 minutes. I want to leave a little bit of time for a dialogue and question and answer, which I think is a lot more useful and interesting than hearing me prattle on. So you'll let me talk a little bit now.
Hi, my name is Megan Krupa. I'm currently on the Data Task Force team at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, which is located at the University of California, Santa Barbara. However, I live in Eagle River, which is just north of Anchorage, with my husband and 2 daughters. Prior to working at NCs, I worked for Alaska Pacific University as an associate professor and also at the University of Alaska as a researcher.
I'm Pete Rand. I'm at the Prince William Sound Science Center in Cordova. I'm a research ecologist there. I've been there since 2015. Prior to that, I was with the Wild Salmon Center, which is based in Portland, Oregon. I've got a long history background in studies of the biology and ecology of Pacific salmon, and interested specifically in migration and interactions between wild and hatchery salmon. I'm currently managing this large multi-year project looking at hatchery and wild interactions in Prince William Sound and Southeast Alaska. I also have a Pacific herring research project underway in Prince William Sound, and I'm also leading this working group with the State of Alaska Salmon and People, focusing on ocean climate and at-sea competition with Pacific salmon, focusing specifically on interactions between pink salmon and sockeye salmon in the North Pacific.
Hi, I'm Krista Oak. I finished out my PhD at McGill in Montreal in 2017, working on evolutionary biology in fishes, especially salmon. Since then, I've been a postdoctoral researcher at University of California, Santa Cruz, but working remotely from Juneau. And starting next week, I'm going to be a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, again, doing a
Good afternoon. My name is Mary Palfola. I'm from Bethel. My mom is from the village of Queefluck, which is the village right upriver from Bethel. My dad was a school teacher in Queefluck, Tututuliak, and Platinum, and then we moved to Bethel when I was in junior high. So I'm from the Kuskokwim River. I grew up commercial fishing on the Kuskokwim River, from start to finish. And we also had a tender boat operation. And then I worked for Fish and Game while I was in college. I spent 10 years in the Alaska State Legislature representing Bethel, and 4 of the years had Dillingham in the House District. And I left in 2009. I worked for the Donlin Gold Project. I was a lobbyist for a couple of years in Juneau. Now I'm working with the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission. It is it represents 33 tribes on the Kuskokwim, and that's what I'm doing now. I have 7 kids. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Stevens. I come from Stevens Village, which is a small village north of Fairbanks on the Yukon. I grew up out there, spending pretty much every single summer out there in the family fish camp, close to Stevens. So I guess you would consider me a subsistence fisherman. For a day job, I work for the Noaa Chiefs Conference out of Fairbanks. I lead advocacy efforts for their hunting and fishing task force.
Good afternoon, Senator Peter Machicki. Thanks for having me here today. Been on the Kenai about 36 years. Commercial fisherman since '92. Sport fisherman my whole life. And we've been looking for some solutions on reducing some of the conflict between the various fisheries. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Thank you.
My name is Tim Coleman. I'm a 46-year sednetter here on the east side, and lifelong Alaskan, mostly here on the Kenai Peninsula. Also, the former business manager and executive officer at the Teamsters Union for many, many years, and here to help with the history, perhaps provide you some insight of how the sednet fishery was and is constituted, and to help with some context for Mr. Machicki.
My name is Andy Mesereau. I'm a charter operator located in Seward, Alaska. I guess I'm a new guy at the table. I've only been fishing for 25 years in Seward. I'm also an IFQ shareholder, and I serve on the North Pacific Fishery Management Council as the recreational fishing representative, starting my 4th year on the council. I'm here today to talk a little bit about compensated reallocation, a market-based solution that we've come up with the North Pacific Council on sharing the halibut resource. And I'll be speaking last, and I probably won't be taking up too much of your time. By then, you'll all be ready to go to the party. So I'll be talking at the very end, and I'm glad to be here. It's on the water for 29 days prior to today, so it's nice to get on the water and be dry for a day. All right, this is dry
And for those who don't know, my name is Ricky Dietz. I'm the Executive Director of Kenai River Sport Fishing Association. I also sit on the South Central Regional Advisory Council for the Federal Subsistence Board, and we deal with similar issues with salmon and allocating salmon for subsistence fisheries on the Kenai Peninsula and in the Copper River drainage. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris and go ahead.
All right, well, like I mentioned, I left my formal talking points on the kitchen table, so I'm going to ramble a bit. And I want to give you just a little bit more about my background. I spent the first half of my life in Texas and roughly the second half of my life in Alaska, as I mentioned, working in fisheries. When people ask me where I'm from, I always sort of freeze, and I'm not sure whether to say Texas or Alaska, but it does feel like Alaska is home now. I moved from Alaska about a year ago to take this position. It was after the election. They were looking for a new head of the National Marine Fisheries Service. It's a political appointment. And as much as I don't like the big city, I took the position, took it on as a challenge and an opportunity, and to bring what I consider the world-class, first-rate experience that I gained in Alaska to the national level. It's one thing to be sort of myopically focused on Alaska fisheries, but over the past year, as you can imagine, I gained tremendous and sometimes painful insights into some of the issues that we're dealing with in other fisheries around the country. So I want to give you a little bit of an overarching policy, political perspective on some of the major themes that I've experienced and that we're approaching fisheries management with, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of our budget and science issues and some of the challenges we face there. When I came on board last summer in the position in DC, one of the first things that was on my desk was a document called National Marine Fisheries Service Annual Priorities and Guidance Document. And it's a document that's developed to sort of internally guide our major activities and what our priorities are and results coming out of those priorities. And it's somewhat of an outward-facing document too, to let the public know what those priorities are. And it all stems from three major overarching goals. And they set it on my desk and said, Chris, this is the document we're about to put out for 2018. You want to make any changes to it? And so the first overarching goal of the three was to ensure the sustainability of fisheries and fishing communities. And the changes, I changed it to say maximize fishing opportunities while ensuring the sustainability of fisheries and fishing communities. Because there are a number of ways, there are a number of fisheries around the country where we're not fully utilizing the available harvest, whether it's choke species or bycatch constraints or outdated regulations. And we've been approaching that pretty aggressively in that form. There's not a huge amount of headroom in our wild stock harvest fisheries, but there's some. The second overarching goal was recover and conserve protected species. As some of you are probably aware, one of the major functions of our agency, in addition to managing fish, is our role under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. National Marine Fisheries Service is responsible for the conservation of a number of species under those two acts. And I added the words recover and conserve protected species while supporting responsible fishing and resource development, because I think that's another reflection of the priorities of this administration, approaching things in a more business-minded manner, with common sense, while still not disregarding the basic science mandate of our mission. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But what I've discovered in this position and is what a huge part of that is for our agency, whether it's oil and gas industry in the Gulf of Mexico or potentially on the East Coast or in the North, or whether it's West Coast salmon issues. We have 27 different runs of salmon or steelhead on the West Coast that are listed as endangered or threatened, and they all intersect with agriculture, with timber, with hydropower, with water users, both agricultural and municipal water users. And so balancing that mandate of our mission to protect and conserve those protected resources with the administration's focus on supporting energy and infrastructure development is a very delicate balancing act. And it's really taken a lot of my focus and a lot of my time. But it's an important balancing act. And I've had my own experience from my time in Alaska, where the federal agencies, in my opinion, our agency, has imposed, under the Endangered Species Act, with regard to stellar sea lions, for example, imposed upon the fishing industry what I felt were overly restrictive and onerous restrictions on our fisheries. So I come into the agency with that background, but I also understand that we have a statutory mandate under the Endangered Species Act that pertains to not only stellar sea lions, but a whole host of species, particularly anadromous fish on the West Coast. The third overarching goal was to improve organizational excellence, and I added the words in regulatory efficiency, because it's not just the number of regulations, but with an agency that within Noaa and the Department of Commerce, Fisheries is the agency that by far promulgates the most regulations, many of them obviously by necessity. But you've seen over the past year a number of executive orders from the president that are directly aimed at cutting red tape and reducing regulatory burden. And so we've been aggressively pursuing that agenda and have made what I think are pretty good strides already. So that gives you a flavor of sort of what the atmosphere that I walked into and that I brought with me into the job too. And at a higher level, when you look at some of the initiatives that are coming from the Department of Commerce and from the greater Noaa, of which Fisheries is a part. There are 6 other line offices within Noaa, including the Weather Service, NESDIS, the Satellite Division, the Office of Atmospheric Research, the National Ocean Service. I know I'm leaving out 1 or 2, but Admiral Gallaudet, who's the current acting head of Noaa, is developing what we call the Blue Economy Initiative, and we're going to be unveiling certain aspects of that soon. But it really, for the fisheries part, it involves basically 3 pillars. One is maximizing our commercial and recreational fishing opportunities. I already spoke a little bit about that, and affect that through our interactions with both the councils and as well as the interstate fishery commissions in the states. And looking at outdated regulations, looking at unnecessary regulations. The second pillar is really an increased focus on our international trade and seafood market interactions, all pursuant to the Secretary's desire to reduce our seafood trade deficit. And while we're not directly in charge of that, a number of other agencies are, we're initiating memorandums of understandings and internal processes to allow us to get our fisheries interests a bigger voice in that discussion as the administration deals with trade policies and tariffs and that sort of thing that directly affect our international seafood markets and trade issues and ultimately our trade deficit. And the third area is, excuse me, marine aquaculture. And this administration, the Secretary in particular, is very interested in promoting marine aquaculture. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of headroom in our wild capture federal fisheries. But with the growing population of the world and the amount of coastline that we have, promoting marine aquaculture is a huge initiative of this administration. And I know in Alaska, at least in terms of finfish aquaculture, that's not always a welcome prospect. But nobody's going to be forcing anybody to undertake marine aquaculture. But we want to make it through the permitting process can be horrendous to get people to actually invest the money to get into marine aquaculture, for example. And so we're poised to unveil basically a national level plan to facilitate people's ability to invest, incentives to invest in, and the ability to effectively prosecute marine aquaculture operations profitably. Talk just a minute about budgets and our science mission. I think many of you know and have seen over the past year, the president's budget, for example, has included the first year that I came on board an 18% reduction in our National Marine Fisheries Service budget, and subsequent year 19, an additional 18% cut in our budget. And I can tell you it's a little intimidating walking into a job like this in a federal agency, and the first thing you hear is your budget just got cut by 36%, and trying to figure out how you're going to maintain your mission, and particularly the science part of our mission. And I've always contended that our baseline science, and that includes our baseline stock assessments, whether it's inshore fisheries, salmon, offshore fisheries, federally managed fisheries, or state managed fisheries, if we lose that basic science, we're screwed. We're nowhere. And so it's going to continue to be my priority. We had what's called our Noaa Fisheries Leadership Council meeting a few months ago, and that consists of myself, our headquarters line office division chiefs, and the science center directors and the regional office directors of each of our regions and science centers, our 5 regions and our 7 science centers. And we were having a very serious discussion about how we're going to prioritize and how we're going to maintain our basic mission. And one of the presentations that we were talking around was a process and analysis that was done at our Southeast Science Center in conjunction with an outside consulting firm, where they went in, and there were a lot of other reasons we were looking at the Southeast Center in particular. But the point I want to make is through this process, there's a very elaborate modeling prioritization process where they go through all the different functions and all the planned research and all the planned activities and basically bend them into 4 bins. And there basically is a box cut into 4 quadrants. And the upper right-hand quadrant was where we ended up with, okay, here are our most mission essential activities, not just mission critical, but mission essential. And the problem with that was, they said, the problem, Chris, is that when you look at what's in that upper right-hand quadrant that we're considering our mission essential activities, we still don't have enough money in the budget to complete those. What do we do? And I said, well, I guess the first thing we do is we take that quadrant and we divide it into 4 more quadrants, and you put another filter on that, and let's come up with a sub-quadrant of what the most mission essential tasks are. So we have each of our 7 science centers right now going through that very process to try to figure out how we can identify the very most mission critical things. And the last thing I want to see is an area like Alaska where we have really good science and robust stock surveys and assessments. I don't want to see us robbing Peter to pay Paul for areas that don't have as robust stock assessments and science behind their management process. So they're all engaged in that activity, and the net result of that activity is to identify what those most critical things are, and then what the impacts are going to be of eliminating, reducing many of the other activities that are fantastic research activities, interesting, but they're not necessarily mission essential. Congress has stepped in and for lack of a better term, bailed us out in a way by restoring many of the cuts that were included in the president's budget. A lot of those had to do with external funding to both academic and state agencies that I know many of you in this room depend on and believe, as I do believe, are absolutely critical. But we had to cut out of our budget proposal many of those external funding channels. So I don't want to go too far. I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So I just wanted to give you that sort of overarching perspective and give you a little bit of my thoughts and philosophy on our current budget climate, and my focus will continue to be on the science part of our mission, but we do have to temper it with the policy and political climate of this administration, and that's a balancing act that's both a challenge and an opportunity. And so I'll just stop talking there for a moment. I'll stop talking, period. And if you have time for questions, great. If not, we can move on.
Sure. Any panelists have any questions for Chris? So I have a question, Chris. When we were talking earlier, you were talking about you have this nice fleet of research boats, but you don't have the funding necessarily to put them out in the water and deploy them for the amount of time. That's an example of what we were talking about earlier and what you were pointing out. But each of these science centers, what are their budgets and what are they looking at? And do each of them have a 36% cut that they're looking at? And kind of maybe go into a little bit more detail.
Well, I don't necessarily have the exact budget numbers for each of the centers off the top of my head, but those budget cuts, percentage-wise, do get spread fairly proportionally across the different regions. So everybody has to figure out how to do their mission with less. And you can't always do more with less. Sometimes you have to do less with less. And so they're all going to be going through that prioritization process. In terms of our big boat, called the white boat fleet, that's an aging fleet, and we are going to be challenged to be replacing some of those vessels. Some of you in the room may know that yesterday or the day before, the Oscar Dyson was out in the Bering Sea doing its annual acoustic trawl survey and other surveys, and they had an engine failure, and they're limping back to Kodiak as we speak. And so we're going to lose part of our Bering Sea shelf survey because of that. And we don't just have the assets and resources to have another ship standing by. It's just it's prohibitively expensive to be able to have those kind of contingencies. What I'm trying to do, and I'll digress a minute. You know, I had the luxury in Alaska working in a region where there was a tremendous amount of trust and collaboration amongst the scientists and the fishing industry and the managers, because of our robust stock survey and assessment process, because of our comprehensive catch accounting and monitoring program. You don't see that in other parts of the country. And I really want to, if I can accomplish anything while I'm in this position, is to see that level of trust between our government, our scientists and managers in the fishing industry. And one of the ways to do that, and one of the ways to fill the gap, if you will, between our aging white ship research fleet and our budget constraints, is to build more cooperative research partnerships, collaborations with the fishing industry. Get fishermen on our boats, get our people on fishermen's boats, and really do a better job of leveraging our cooperative research opportunities.
Thank you, Chris. So I grew up commercial fishing, and all 5 species. We didn't really have a pink harvest, but I don't know a whole lot about pinks because we don't have a big return on the Kuskokwim, at least not one that people are, you know, really actively going after. But now that we've had, you know, such a downturn in Chinook stocks, and this year our real depleted stock seems to be silvers, and you know, just trying to find out what is going on. There's so many theories, and probably it's a combination of all of those theories. But one of the things that has come up recently is this theory that there's not enough fish food for king salmon in the ocean, and that one of their main competitors is pinks, hatchery pinks. And so when I heard you say, you know, supporting aquaculture, I thought, oh no, you know, so I just wondered if you could speak to that, because it's a new silver bullet, I mean, smoking gun, I guess, in my mind.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if pinks is one example. As I said, we're keenly interested in providing the necessary regulatory structure and research structure to allow people around the country, if they so choose, to develop marine food fish aquaculture operations. And whether that's appropriate for Alaska, as I mentioned earlier, I know sometimes aquaculture is a dirty word in Alaska, particularly when you talk about salmon aquaculture. Much of the production of pink salmon is in a different, or other, you know, hatchery production of salmon in Alaska is done in a little bit different context than what I think people in the other parts of the country think of as aquaculture. But whether and which species are appropriate for aquaculture hatchery production is going to be totally dependent on the situation in a particular area of the country or a particular state. Obviously, Alaska is almost its own another country up here. So I think that's going to be up to the people of the state of Alaska to decide whether and to what extent that's appropriate at all.
All right, we're going to switch gears and go on to our first panel. Our first panel is going to talk about the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project. And we've got 3 panelists who've introduced themselves. The first panelist is going to talk about resurrecting the public record, assessing stakeholder participation in the Board of Fisheries process from 1959 to present. The second topic is going to be interacting effects of ocean temperature and at-sea competition on Alaska salmon. And the third topic is changes in size and age of Alaska salmon. One of the cool things about this collaborative approach to research, which Dr. Krupa is going to give a little bit more of an overview, is that it integrates federal agencies, state agencies, universities, and independent researchers, some associated with their own businesses, others associated with nonprofit organizations, but taking a little bit higher level approach to defining a common problem and then finding out different ways to tackle that problem. The other interesting thing that I like about this project is that it's trying to integrate computers and databases. So it's integrating this project with the Board of Fisheries, goes back and it integrates all different proposals, but it allows the public to have an accessible database that they can go look at. Some of the other projects that they're doing, the state of Alaska had 5 different databases, 4 or 5 different databases for escapements under statehood management of salmon. Those now have been integrated into one database, and you can or will be able to query it in the future. I think it's really important as we move forward in the 21st century that the science that we fund, the science that we have is open and available to the public, and that it's not just stuck on somebody's shelf and kind of becomes kind of boutique science. We spend a lot of money on science, and we need to have this information out there publicly available to members of the public, but then also other researchers so that they can build upon that knowledge. With that, Megan, go ahead.
Okay, so hang on, it's going to be a little bit of a wild ride here. In addition to being on the SASAP project, I'm also an Alaska Salmon Fellow, which you will hear more about in panel 2. But I just want to give you a really quick introduction. This is a program of the Alaska Humanities Forum. And you can read through that if you can see it. It's kind of small, I apologize. But the basic concept behind this project is you put a group of people who otherwise would never meet or interact into a room, and you have them talk about all of the complexities and issues surrounding salmon. And I can speak personally, to me, it's been an amazing experience. I've met people that I've seen or kind of parallel universes. But in our group, you have scientists and subsistence users, a TV star. So we have a pretty diverse group of people, and you'll see how amazing the fellows are when we get to panel 2. I just wanted to quickly mention that, and then I'll give a brief interview to the state of Alaska salmon and people. I came to this project just about 2.5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago. And I was flown down to Santa Barbara, and I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And they said, no, it's going to be great. Just show up. So this is an enormous, enormous project. And I am very proud to be a part of it. It has brought, similar to the Salmon Fellows, it has brought a group of people together from all different backgrounds and disciplines. Many of you probably have heard the term ivory tower, but it's a real problem, not just in academia, but in everyday life. It causes a lot of strife and a lot of data blockage. So, next one. This project involves roughly 106 people, a whole slew of community members and PhDs and citizens. And the goal of the project, just to give you kind of a mile-high view, is that and Ricky alluded to this. So right now there are a lot of different databases out there. And when data is collected, one season it's collected using a set of methods. And then the next season, for very good reasons, they might have to change the methods for that data. They might move the equipment, which is going to change the way that data was collected. So when you go to put this data into a data set, you have to build algorithms to make sure that the data can talk to each other over time. And this is the real challenge of building huge data sets. And so by bringing NCs, which is the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, say that 20 times, into the SASAP project, a lot of us, a lot of the scientists all of a sudden had this huge tool at our disposal, and that we had access to computer programmers and people who could make these data sets talk to each other. So that's kind of the general idea behind the project. And one thing I really like about this project too is that it included rural Alaska. And so a lot of the projects that I'm involved in don't necessarily bring in rural Alaska. And this project was very intentional in its creation to make sure that that was part of everything we did, and that their voice was heard and they were on the table and we were considering those issues as well. So it's broken up into 2 rounds. The project is actually officially over, I believe, or soon to be over. I think at the end of October is the final. We got a slight extension. So you'll hear from the other two panelists, and feel free to go to the website and look at them. All of the data sets will be publicly accessible. So you'll be able to go in and you'll be able to see everything that we did. I'm writing a manual so that if you wanted to do it yourself, you'd have to be crazy, but you could do it. So that's another thing I really like about the project, is it's making data accessible to the public. Okay, so my journey to SafeSap begins here on the Kenai Peninsula. Several years ago, when I was at the University of Alaska, I worked on a project called Salmon 2050, and many of you in this room participated in this project. And it was during this project effort that I really started to think about putting together the project I'm working on right now in SafeSap. So I was working with stakeholder participation, and I was looking at who is participating in the fisheries process, right? In Alaska, we have an amazing public process. Anybody can submit a proposal to the Board of Fish. So who are those people? What are they saying? Who's participating in the Kenai River fishery? Who's showing up at meetings? Who shows up to the classic roundtable, right? So I was looking at all of these moving parts in Alaska fisheries. And my background is in biology, but I also have a strong background in policy and management, specifically fisheries management, and within that specifically salmon. So those are the types of questions I was looking at. So one day I was sitting in my office at the University of Alaska, and I was thinking about the information that the Board of Fish gets. What types of information does the Board of Fish get? They get 3-year summaries of biological data. How come they're not getting social data? Because social data is locked up in the State Library, Archives and Museum in Juneau in boxes, 12 by 24 boxes, right? So they're not seeing the public comments over time. They're not looking at this big social data set that's sitting in this archive. They're looking at biological data, which is important, but there's a whole other piece that exists. So the question I started asking in my little office at UAA was, what if we took that data and we made it function like biological data so that we could run the same analyses on that social data? Could we make it usable for the Board of Fish? And my example is, let's say a person on the Board of Fish gets a proposal and they want to know, has this proposal ever been submitted before? Who has submitted this proposal? What did the other boards say about this proposal? What types of science? What did ADF&G say about this proposal? Well, right now, no one can figure that out because that data is locked in SLAM. So I found some women that were equally crazy as I was, and I convinced them to fly down to Juneau with me and spend about a month scanning 950,000 pieces of paper that ranged from today's paper to like old school, we call it toilet seat cover paper because that's basically what it is, like super thin paper from the 1950s and 60s. So these are our stats. You can see that we spend a lot of time. Those are staples that have to be individually removed from every single proposal. So if you're ever going to submit a proposal to the Board of Fish, don't be stapled. Then we set up, so when you have words instead of numbers, because that's what we're looking at here. In biological data, you've got numbers. In my data set, you have words. So when you have words, you have to keep those words very simple, and it has to be incredibly straightforward. My team comes from Southern California. So the people that did the coding on this database had to be trained not only in how to code, but they had to be trained in the species of salmon and all of our different types of fisheries within the entire state of Alaska. It took me about 12 months to get them coding at a reliable and replicable speed. I had no idea how complicated our fisheries are, but I learned quickly. So we produced some initial results. Our first paper just came out within the last month. And this paper is a pilot study. It's only looking at 3 regions. It's looking at Bristol Bay, Cook Inlet, and Southeast Alaska. So in this pilot study, we started looking at who are the people that are submitting proposals, and then who's successful. So basically we ran statistics on who are the most successful participants within the Board of Fish process within these 3 regions. And I can get you the paper if you're interested in this. It's open access, anybody can get it. Super important to me that all papers are open access. But you can see here, so what we have started to see within this very small it's only 15-year study, 2000 to 2015 in 3 regions, is that the advisory committees are in fact successful, largely. You are more likely to get a proposal passed through the Board of Fish if you go through an AC. Obviously, the Board of Fish and ADF&G are pretty successful within their proposals. But this is a demo to show you what this database can do. So in addition to maybe providing with individual Board of Fish members with information on prior actions on any proposal topic, this can give user groups information on how they might participate more successfully, or who is participating more successfully, or help them better understand the system. It's also important to note that one thing we're going to be looking for when we run the entire database, which we are about 2 weeks from doing, is from 1959 to the present, who is not participating in the Board of Fish. So we're going to pair this with demographic information from ADF&G and look at who is currently participating. Are they men? Are they women? Are they young? Are they older? And so that also plays a key role in fisheries management, because if you have a group of people who are hardcore participants and they're all in their 60s and 70s, is this a sustainable process moving forward, or is the process going to have to adapt? So we started talking with ADF&G about actions like that. This is just a pretty simple display of the proportion of submitted proposals by group and region. So, we're seeing some regional differences in the types of proposals that are being submitted, and differences within which groups are dominating which areas. Cook Inlet has a lot of individuals participating in the Board of Fish, not surprising. This is just a quick example of something that we are hoping to do. So we are hoping to take all of the information that we have from these proposals and pair it with some data that we have with the other data sets within SASAP. So we can run our social data or the public process data against the biological data, also harvest and escapement numbers, to see when there are low numbers of fish, does the participation in the Board of Fish spike, and vice versa. So we can start looking at trends over time to see how this process is functioning. So this is my very busy last slide. We have a couple more projects in the work. I've been approached by the Board of Game to do this with game as well. This is a highly replicable process. Anybody can do it. There are some states right now that are attempting and starting to do it with their own Board of Fish and Board of Game processes. The value I see in this is that it's bringing the public's concerns into the light. And when you look at 1959 to the present, can we see trends in the public? Is the public being responded to? Are they being ignored? Are they crazy, right? So we need to be able to see how this process is playing out. And also, this data set can be used. I mean, it actually can be used as a management tool to look at participation over time. I'll end there.
All right, thanks. We'll move on to the second one. Interacting effects of ocean temperatures and at-sea competition on Alaska salmon.
Thank you, Ricky. Thanks for coming to the session. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm come to this session as a scientist. I mentioned in my introduction I'm very curious about the biology and ecology of Pacific salmon. So, and one of the problems in the field of science is that we're often kind of siloed ourselves. We're focusing on a particular problem in a particular region. There might be a set of streams or marine areas that we're focusing on. But as Ricky mentioned, this SASAP, actually, yeah, go back one more. The SASAP program has really given us an opportunity to, at least for me, to broaden the work and try to understand what's going on in other parts of the North Pacific system. And so I always have an eagle eye on these funding opportunities where it gives us an opportunity to meet together and share knowledge. And so SASAP and particularly the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which has been really visionary in terms of bringing the science forward in terms of science, salmon science and salmon management. So my hat's off to the Moore Foundation for making this possible. So with Megan's basically organizational chart of SASAP, we're basically one of those boxes. We're a round 2 working group. So I led the one that was really focused primarily on the ocean life history of salmon and looking specifically at pink salmon and sockeye salmon. One of the kind of my pet peeves is that many people use words like mystery or black box, or the problems are intractable in the ocean. We just don't understand enough about the marine life history. Well, I'm here to say that we know a good deal about what's going on in the ocean. And so we've had a real great opportunity to bring some leading scientists together to try to synthesize what we know about the marine life history of salmon. And so those people pictured in that last slide were basically convened as part of the SASAP, and it's been a really great opportunity to work with them. So this is probably one of the key kind of take-home messages I like to focus on. This effort has made it possible to pull together a lot of information on abundance of salmon across the North Pacific. And so we're looking at from Asia all the way around to North America, understanding hatchery releases and wild fish in each one of these regions. Greg Rougeroni and Jim Irvin specifically, who are members of our working group, has pulled together and published information on this. So this is a time series of abundance. This is pink salmon, but the same trends are evident in all the other species as well. So 2 important aspects to focus on here. One is that this goes back to 1925, so this is almost a 100-year record of abundance of salmon, in this case Pacific salmon. And so the trend is important here. It was basically low through the 60s, and this initiated a lot of interest in hatcheries at that time. But a dramatic change happened in the ocean in 1977, the so-called ocean regime shift. Many people attribute this rise in abundance to good management, but really it's about favorable ocean conditions leading to increased productivity. And so now we have more salmon in the ocean than we ever have over this period of record, 100 years. So that's a really important point to make. And second, specifically with pink salmon, you get this odd even year change in abundance. And it's very dramatic, and it's been particularly dramatic in recent years. And this is, as I see as a scientist, it's a natural experiment. So we can actually look to see how growth and survival changes in salmon in years when pink salmon are less abundant and when they are at peak abundance. And so this gives us a really important insight into what we call at-sea competition or density dependence. So that's one of the key things we're looking at, along with changes in the ocean. So you've probably heard a lot about the blob. This is an unusually warm, it's called a marine heat wave that occurred in the North Pacific, and it's had clearly some implications on food webs and on salmon in particular. Next. So this is a paper that recently came out by Sonia Batten and co-authors. We were involved in contributing some of the salmon information to this. But basically, it's a concept called Trophic Cascades. It's a disruption in the food web, and it's really the only way to describe this is changes in pink salmon from odd and even years. So you see all of these indices. We have hatching success on the top panel, abundance of zooplankton, and abundance of phytoplankton below that. And we can see these alternating changes in abundance between all of these trophic levels. And it corresponds with this cycle in pink salmon. It's the only way to describe this. And so we're seeing over a broad area, this includes southern Bering Sea and northern Gulf of Alaska, we see a very broad changes occurring in the food web structure, and it's attributable to changes in pink salmon. Next. So one of the key things, the title of the talk includes the word interaction. So we know changes are happening in the ocean in terms of warmer sea surface temperatures, and we're also seeing changes in abundance as you've seen. So we're particularly interested in interacting, and our hypothesis is that in years of relatively warm water, particularly in the west coast, the lower range of Pacific salmon, that translates into poorer condition and survival of young salmon entering the ocean. We think when you add density dependence to that, these stocks would become even more vulnerable. It's what we call the double whammy hypothesis. And that's precisely what we're seeing. So that that curve on the bottom, I'm sorry, on the top, shows these west coast stocks. So a thumb down indicates relatively poor ocean conditions and warmer sea surface temperatures, and that makes density dependence even more exaggerated. And so we see this double whammy effect occurring in west coast stocks. As you move north in the Gulf of Alaska, we see a positive effect on survival, and yet we still see these negative effects on growth and survival related to the densities of pink salmon. So we think it's basically important to look at both of these things simultaneously, to look at changes in the ocean and also how densities of salmon are changing in the ocean. Next slide. And this is, Krista's going to talk a little bit more about this, but a component of our project is also looking at growth and size changes over time for salmon, specifically sockeye salmon. And so we're doing this through scale analysis. This was also another product from the SASAP effort. A lot of the scale data has been collected by Fish and Game. We were able to, through the data task force, get additional scale measurements made. And so we're measuring the distance between these annuli that are laid down on the scales. And that gives us an indication of how fast these salmon are growing at sea. And that plot that's shown in the top right, again, you see this even and odd year changes. When pink salmon are less abundant, you see much faster growth in sockeye salmon, and vice versa. This is very consistent across a lot of different stocks, not just in Alaska, but also in British Columbia. And what does this translate into when you also add the effects of warm ocean conditions in recent years? We're seeing a long-term decline in size. And Krista, of course, will show you a much more extensive database on this. This is Copper River sockeye salmon. This is the same age fish, and this includes this year's data too. It's the smallest fish recorded on record. So, so this all has, I think, really important implications for sustainability of salmon. Okay. So that's all I have. I just want to put a pitch in for the SASAP program and for my organization, Prince William Sound Science Center in Cordova. Our mission includes both research and education, and we're really interested in this question outreach. And so I encourage you to get in contact with SASAP folks and with me in particular if you have any other questions. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you. Next up, Chris.
Great, thanks, and thanks for having me. Really looking forward to talking to you today about some of the work we've been doing on changes in the size and age of Alaska salmon. When I say we, we're also one of the round 2 working groups, and like I mentioned, we have a big group of people from different universities and agencies from across the state, California, Washington, and also elsewhere in the States and in Canada. Oh, I think we missed a slide there. Okay. So at least since the 70s, people across the state have been noticing changes in the size and age of salmon. And these changes have been noted by scientists, subsistence users, there's commercial and sport fishermen alike. Just one example, you may have heard that the Sitka Salmon Derby this year had the smallest winner on record. And these changes in size and age of salmon have potential real-world consequences for ecosystems and for people in the state. From an ecosystem perspective, if salmon are getting smaller, it means there may be fewer marine-derived nutrients that are coming into these ecosystems that really depend on them. And it might also mean that there are actually fewer salmon because larger female salmon have more eggs, they have bigger eggs, and they dig deeper, better protected nests, so they should have more offspring. If you're a subsistence user, smaller salmon means that per fish, you're going to have fewer grams of protein and fewer calories going into your freezer. And for the commercial fishery, we might see lost profits either due to foregone biomass or actually because smaller fish can't be made into the same product types and they're worth less per pound than bigger fish. There's been a number of hypotheses put forward as to what might be driving these changes. Backslash, yeah. So one of the classic suspects when we see changes in size and age of the harvested fish is that we might be seeing fisheries-induced evolution due to size-selected gears. But we might also be seeing a response to changing climate. So as the climate is warming, fish are going to have higher metabolic rates and they're going to require more food to grow. Or warmer waters might actually mean a degradation of habitat quality so in a way that there isn't as much food available. It could also be a response to rebounding marine mammal predator populations. For example, orcas we know feed selectively on larger and older Chinook. Or as Pete just mentioned, there are more salmon in the ocean right now than there ever have been before. We could be seeing the effects of competition at sea where there's just not enough food to go around. So we were really interested in taking the SASAP opportunity where we have these great new tools that have been put together to look across the state at different species and look at these patterns in size and age. So the data that I'm going to talk about today were collected by Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Lights were measured in the field, and then scales were sent back to the lab and measured ages from scales. Those data have been compiled for a long time in ADF&G datasets. ADF&G shared with NC's data on over 14 million salmon from across the state. I just want to take a moment here to acknowledge what a huge amount of work that must have been on the part of ADF&G. You know, you think about that 14 million times that someone put a fish in front of them and measured it or read an age off the scale. And so we feel really excited and thankful to be able to work with these data sets. And we just want to take a moment to thank ADF&G for collecting this data and sharing it with NCs. So the folks at NCs took these data and synthesized them into data products, which we then analyzed. And we can start to look at these questions in changing size by looking at the difference in mean length before 1990 versus after 2010 in populations where we have good data in both of those periods. And here, if you're seeing those boxes fall below that red zero line, that suggests that length is generally decreasing. So there are a few things to notice here. First of all, you're not seeing any pink salmon up there. And that's unfortunately because we just didn't have enough data to include pink salmon in any of our analyses. But looking at the species we do have, you see that length is generally declining across the state. But there's variation in how it's declining among species. So the largest magnitude changes are happening in Chinook. But even in Chinook, if you look at the different areas, you see variation in those changes. For example, in Southeast, we're not seeing the same changes as we are in the other areas. Even within the same species in the same area, we see differences among populations in size trends. So on that figure, each of those gray dots is a different population. And behind some of those boxes, you see a pretty big spread. So it seems like different populations, in some cases, are doing pretty different things. So overall, we're seeing a decline in size and age, but there's variation among species, among areas, and among populations. We can also look at mean length through time. And this is kind of overall for the state for the 4 different species. There are a few things to notice here. First of all, the y-axis on those plots are going to be changing in each of the different panels because these are pretty different sized fish, so I want you to be able to see what's going on in each of those fish. But again, you'll notice that the magnitude of decline is greatest in Chinook. You'll also notice that these aren't just straight linear declines. Instead, there's a lot of variability through time in those patterns. And we're seeing periods of increase and periods of decrease in size. So again, we're generally seeing a decline in size, but again, lots of variability. So far I've been talking about average population body length, but we know that average population length can change for 2 different reasons. First, we could see changes in the average size at age. So for the same age, we might be seeing smaller salmon, presumably because they're not growing as fast. Or we might actually see changes in average population length because of changing age structure, such that younger, smaller fish are making up a larger proportion of the population. And so we can use something called the chain rule, which I'm not going to go into today. It's basically just a fancier version of this equation to look at the proportion of change in length that's due to these 2 factors. If we do that, and we look at the proportion of change that's due to age structure in black versus size of age in yellow in different regions across the state, we can see that that plot is mostly black, and it seems like changes in length are mostly due to changing age structure with a much more minor contribution of changing size of age. The exception to that is in coho, where we see a bigger contribution of size and age. And that makes sense if we think about the life history of coho. Most of them come back after a single year at sea, and so we know they don't have as much capacity to shift their age structure. So if we're seeing changes in length, it makes sense that there would be a bigger contribution of changing size at age for coho. So we're just kind of in the middle of our analyses on what might actually be driving these changes, so I don't have results to show you here. But what I can tell you is that so far we haven't been finding any smoking guns. There's no one driver that's overwhelmingly explaining these changes. Instead, what we're seeing are small contributions of a lot of different drivers, including ones I mentioned before, fisheries, climate, marine mammal predators, and competition at sea. And what we're also seeing is that when we're trying to explain these patterns of changing length and changing age using the data we have on these different drivers, we're not actually able to explain much of the variation. And so what that suggests to us is that this big data approach that we've taken by looking across the state and looking at all these different species might just be too coarse. We might need to actually zoom in on individual populations because they may be responding to these different stressors differently. So we're really excited to be continuing this work looking at drivers, and ultimately we're hoping to start working on the consequences of these changes in size and age for ecosystems and people across the state. So to real quickly sum up, we saw that length has generally declined over time, but there's variation in how that's occurring, with the largest changes occurring in Chinook. And we saw that when we're seeing these changes in length, it can mostly be explained by changing age structure and a much more minor contribution of changing size and age. And so with that, I'd just like to, again, thank all the funding agencies and people who made this work possible. So again, we're funded through the SAFE initiative at NCs. Their funding comes from NOAA's Impact Investing and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Again, a huge thank you to ADF&G for the incredible amount of work that they did to collect this data and to share it with us. And if you'd like to learn more about the SAFE initiative, visit this link at alaskasalmonandpeople.org to learn more about the other working groups and what we've been up to. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, do you have any questions or thoughts on?
I did have a question on that last slide, that very last slide. Wasn't so much you were seeing changing age length, but you were seeing a changing age structure. It wouldn't surprise me that younger fish are going to be not as long. So can you explain to me the changing age structure? Is it stream specific, time specific? Help me understand the changing age structure as the driver.
Yeah, so it seems that when we're seeing these declines in length pretty consistently, they're happening because of these changing age structures. So basically, yeah, more younger fish making up that population, and that's been pretty consistent among the different species, of course, with the exception of coho. It's been especially striking in Chinook, which again makes sense. You've got more age structures, so you've got more ability to change.
Are they returning earlier? Is that? Yeah, they're returning it.
Yeah, so this is age at maturity. Yeah.
Any questions in the audience for anybody on panel one?
Just one observation, I guess, is that almost everything you're saying happens identically with the halibut stocks. About 4 years ago, they went through a major conundrum because there was tons of juvenile halibut, and all of them were smaller and not growing as to become harvested. Just an observation.
Yeah, we've been really interested in looking at what's going on in other marine fish at the same time, and also just generally there's been trends in a lot of different animals for smaller size and maturity, but yeah, particularly looking at the other harvested marine fish, we'd really love to do that.
Peter, you have a question?
So just thinking historically, is there any comparison with the failed historic, say, European salmon runs with anything we're seeing today? Is there anything historic to refer back to, where there are size declines or habitat issues, or oceanic climatic issues, or just overfishing? Do we know? Have we made any kind of comparison?
So for Atlantic salmon, I know they have also seen changes or declines in size. Where a lot of that work's actually been done is in Atlantic cod. Before cod on the East Coast collapsed, they also saw a declining size and age. And so there is this suggestion that this may be a bit of a canary in the coal mine, that when we see these changes, it might be an indication that something is up that we really need to pay attention to. And we would like to do more work on that. Haven't gotten there yet, but it's an interesting next step.
Yes, in the back there, with the hat.
So, are you saying that salmon are coming back? I mean, I always think of salmon as kind of a finite age coming back, maybe a year. But you're saying salmon are maturing a year earlier? I mean, if you think of it in year classes, the salmon coming back, they're actually maturing a year earlier, per se. That's what you're saying. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this age structure for salmon, which I think was kind of a finite thing when they come back.
Yeah, so more so than like these big changes, it's not really that we're seeing them coming back at ages we've never seen them come back at before. But in the species where we have variability, and we've always had, some come back as 2 ocean, some come back as 3 ocean, we're seeing a larger proportion of the 2 ocean or the younger age classes. So it's not necessarily new ones, it's just a shift towards the ones that have always been there, but smaller proportion.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to hear all this stuff about the blob. Okay, I've been a fisherman in Alaska since 1966. I've been a drifter in Cookeville, okay? And how come all of a sudden we have all the silver salmon, pink salmon, and chum salmon? Did they miss the blob when they were out in the ocean? Is that what the problem is? Somebody's got to, there's something else going on besides the blob. I mean, it's like, how come these species that feed on the same thing are coming back large and large numbers to Cookeville, and our sockeye and our pink salmon are down? Can you explain that to me? I'm tired of hearing the word blob or excuse.
Yeah, well, I think it is important to note some stocks in some regions don't seem to be affected by that. So I think it's a question of spatial use of the ocean, and certain stocks I think were really exposed to unusually warm sea surface temperatures. And it's also a food, it's not just temperature, but it's the, of course, the food web changes associated with it. So I think there's been a lot of irregular returns, particularly in sockeye this year that you note, and other species. But yeah, I definitely acknowledge it's not universal. There's definitely some stocks and regions where that doesn't seem directly impacted.
We found sockeye salmon in driftweed this year that had candlefish in them and stuff. And for years, I've been told they're more of a crustacean feeder. Could you explain that to me, why they're eating candlefish and stuff like that?
Based on the diet data I've seen, it's squid and fish is mostly their diets at sea. Not much like, I mean, they do eat crustaceans, zooplankton, but particularly when they get large, they're eating larger prey.
Do you think maybe our current capacity of the ocean's been stressed out to its limits, you can't take it anymore?
I think there's a lot of indications that if you look at growth and survival, that's basically what our working group is looking at. There's definitely indications of that.
All right, one last question.
Yeah, so in 2015, there was 140 million pink salmon returned Prince William Sound, so that weighs what, 434 million pounds, and so that would eat approximately 8 to 10 million pounds of seafood a day. That pink blob. And so are you seeing anything that, I mean, can you correlate that to the year class, the age classes that are coming back, that are missing now?
In other species or?
In red salmon generally.
Yeah, certainly there's convincing evidence of growth effects on sockeye. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that. And we see, in a number of stocks, this effect of pink salmon density. So it's definitely affecting them. It depends on where you're at. It seems to have much less effect on Bering Sea and Bristol Bay region, but in the Gulf of Alaska and in West Coast stocks, we're seeing this pink salmon effect.
And so that's 240 million pounds of seafood in a month, right? Am I right in thinking that?
I have to look at that.
Well, it's
your numbers,
2%, and I think 2% is low, but up there, what they eat in biomass, so almost 500 million pounds of biomass, 2% would be a lot.
Yeah. Well, when you look at the salmon biomass in the North Pacific, 40% of them are of hatchery origin, which is staggering. 40%. So our ability to make changes to the abundance through hatchery releases is quite tremendous.
All right, we're going to switch gears. We're going to go on to panel 2, but I want you to look at the Chinook size at mean length over time from the 1980s to where we are today. That's over a 10% drop just in size. The Kenai River, we'll talk a little bit about the Kenai River. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Kuskokwim and the Yukon. I thought it'd be important to, we look at data, we see a line, but what does it mean in social situations? So these are the 3 watersheds that we're going to talk about, the Kenai, the Kuskokwim, and the Yukon. The Kenai is one of the world's great sport fishing rivers. It's short, it's 82 miles. The Kuskokwim supports the largest subsistence fishery for king salmon in Alaska. The Yukon covers one of the great areas for a watershed in the country. It's the 3rd largest watershed that we have. This is from ADF&G. These trends in the decline for king salmon are statewide. Every watershed in Alaska that has king salmon has had a decline in size for king salmon. We see more younger fish coming, and what Chris was talking about is that this decline in size, this combination are the fish that are coming back at the same age class through time, and they're also, those are smaller fish, but then also we're getting more and more of younger fish returning, so there's more H3 fish instead of 4 ocean fish instead of 5 ocean fish. So here's a little composite of pictures from the Kenai. The top 10 world records for king salmon on the Kenai came in the 1980s and the early 1990s in about a 10-year window of time. There's Les Anderson in the middle. There's Harry Gaines, and we see different people on the bottom. These are the largest of the kings that we have within the sport fisheries anywhere in the world. You can go anywhere in the world and you talk about these big king salmon that come back to the Kenai River. This anchors the sport fishery in Cook Inlet. We get the most sport fishing angler days any place in the state here on the Kenai River. King returns coming back in May, June, and July. And you can see for the total returns, those last decades are the smallest returns that we've had on record. So typically in the, and you can stretch that back into the 80s also, we've had anywhere between 40 to 60, 70, 80,000 fish returning. In the last decade, the returns have been typically less than 30,000. Few years, 3 of those years have been less than 20,000. So a little more than a decade ago, the Kenai River was ranked as the #1 sport fishery in North America for king salmon. And in the last decade, every year that we've had a king salmon fishery, we've had restrictions and closures in the king salmon fishery. It impacts not only the sport fishery, it impacts the personal use fishery, and it impacts the commercial fishery. The commercial fishery has had more restrictions and closures in the past decade than probably the decades prior to that. And in 2012, we had an emergency fishery disaster declaration. Some of that money went back to compensating both guides and set net fishermen and processors for lost opportunity, but also a portion of that money went towards research to trying to find out what are the bottlenecks of productivity. When you look at it in isolation, we may think, oh, it might have something to do with an individual watershed. But taken collectively across this whole state where you're seeing these same trends, much of the research needs to be put into the ocean environment. We've seen large declines in guided and unguided angler days. Some years we've kind of the peak number of angler days was in 2007. We've had 90% declines in some years since 2007 on any individual. This year was no different. We started off with king salmon fishing with catch and release only, and we were closed halfway through June for the early run king salmon fishery. In July, we started off with no bait, and by the middle of the month, we were into catch and release, and we made escapements this year, the minimum escapements, but that was only with catch and release fishery and the sport fishery, and with severe limitations and restrictions in the commercial fishery. What we've seen in anglers is we've seen a shift in anglers going from coming to this area for primarily king salmon fishing. We've seen shifts. We've had a 50% increase in the number of angler days for sockeye fishing on the Kenai River in the last decade as anglers search for a different species of fish to fish for. We've also seen kind of a shift in when people are booking trips in the guided industry. We've seen shifts going into August and September and October, fishing on silver salmon more so than on king salmon. We've seen guides expanding into sockeye fishing, both on the bank fishing, but then also down into the personal use fishery. These shifts in behaviors have impacted our economy, whether it's the retail shops that we have. You can go talk with any of the Sportsman's Warehouse. You can talk with Trustworthy. You can talk with Fred Meyer. You can talk with Three Bears. We don't have as much retail activity in May and June as we once did. You can talk to lodges. You can go out East Redoubt Road. We had probably 20 B&Bs down East Redoubt Road. Now I think we probably have 2 or 3. If there were any guides that focused exclusively on king salmon a decade ago, they're no longer in business. You cannot support yourself just fishing for king salmon. You've had to diversify into these other areas, other fisheries that we talked about. We've also talked about real estate. Real estate, although we did have a real estate kind of bust about a decade ago, kind of nationally with recession, this real estate on this river isn't as hot as it once was in terms of what properties are selling for. The king salmon fishery drew interest into this fishery, and we're feeling the impacts of that decline. So Mary, I'm going to shift over to you and talk about how has the Kuskokwim dealt with these changes in abundance for king salmon?
All right, well, as Ricky said earlier, the Kuskokwim has the largest subsistence fishery in the state. For out of all of the Chinook caught in the state of Alaska for subsistence, half of them were caught on the Kuskokwim. The average, since Fish and Game has been doing subsistence harvest surveys, the average for collectively on our 900-mile river, the average is 80,550 per year, or 80,500, I think. And the highest we've ever recorded subsistence harvest was 115,000 Chinook. And these were when Chinook were large, when most of our Chinook, I mean, now most of our Chinook that come back are a bit like big chums. I was saying to somebody, we you know, when you ask somebody, how many fish did you catch? What did you catch? They'll say like, oh, I caught 5 kings. And then I'd have to say, are those jack kings, chum-sized kings, or real kings? You know, and I'm sure you guys see that. So, you know, that if you put up 40 or 80 kings in the 90s, those were big kings. I have a slide of my kids in the smokehouse. I don't know if you put those up, but maybe. But I mean, they're like the size of small children. You know how kings are, but they're not that size anymore. It's very rare to see a very large Chinook. So, well, and I was thinking about Ricky's question. How did our communities respond? Well, you all know it's extremely emotional. And I feel a little bit like two people, like I have two sides of me. The January, February, March Mary who goes to fish meetings, and then the one in May and June, where it's like, I feel like my animal instincts are coming out and that real competitiveness. Like when I see a king in my net, I stop breathing until it's in the boat. I'm sure you guys are the same way. So a lot of us came to the meetings, of course, really concerned because I didn't need to see Bethel test fish numbers to know that our harvest was very small in 2010. They were smaller fish, mostly males. People in Middle Kuskokwim, people in Antioch were saying, yeah, I took the day off on Friday, but I only caught 5 fish. You know, and it only takes an hour or two to cut 5 fish. So just very depressed, you know, and even now in 2018, you go to a fish meeting and you can, I call it the 7 stages of grief, and you can kind of see where people are on any given, and you know, I think I went through my denial and anger phase, and I'm at acceptance, and then you go to a meeting and all of a sudden you're angry and depressed again. So it's you know, bouncing up and down, but so 2010 we saw our first restrictions, 2011, 2012. When the state put in restrictions in 2012, we had a number of local UPIC people who were doing protest fishing, and there were certain villages that were really active in it. We had between 30 and 40 people cited. Some of them went to jail, you know, criminal records. So in 2013, the state of Alaska Department of Fish and Game, they did not want to do any restrictions. So we had a completely unrestricted king harvest that year. That year, I think the escapement, it was listed as 42, but Fish and Game has readjusted their forecast and escapements in prior years now. So maybe they're thinking it was like 38,000 escaped or spawned that year. And I do have to do a disclaimer here. My pet peeve is with the word escapement. Because that kind of escape, it makes it sound like you threw it away, or you know, like it's not going up and spawning and multiplying. I would much rather use the word spawners than escapement. But that year we saw the lowest number of spawners reached the headwaters that we had ever seen, less than 40,000. And this is, we had seen escapement or, total run size between 400,000 and 450,000. The red bars are what had been harvested for subsistence or commercial back when we harvested commercial. The green bars are spawners. So, now if you look at the years since 2010, I think most years since then, the harvest goal has been less than 40,000. And we're talking about 33 villages on a 900-mile river. And trying to explain to people is very challenging. I heard somewhere that the power upside only thinks about the intent, and the power downside only thinks about the effects. So what we're talking about are people who are, who have a lot of food insecurity issues anyway, and Chinook was really a cornerstone of our subsistence larder. Most of our freezers had a huge portion of it devoted to our king salmon, dry fish. So one of the things that happened in 2014 is a number of people went to Board of Fish and said, what are we going to do about these headwater fish? So what the Board of Fish enacted is what we refer to now as the front end closure. So from May 25th until June 11th, there is no salmon harvest. There are a couple Saturday chances to go fish for whitefish with 4-inch gear, but we're really not, and what we saw actually were people setting their nets and hanging nets loose and setting them so they could harvest kings. And the feedback that we got from a large portion of the villages was, you're making us fish for kings with the wrong gear. And so clearly, the messaging wasn't that great. But in 2015, working with the federal government, so also in that time frame, 2011, 12, 13, we had a lot of special action requests to the Federal Subsistence Board. Because our river is, the lower portion is all in federal waters, we were able to go to the Federal Subsistence Board, and under ANILCA protections, in ANILCA they have to manage for conservation and access to subsistence. So the feds took over management in 15, 16, 17, and this year. And so the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission, we advise, we have 4 in-season managers who are from the river, different sections of the river, who advise our federal refuge manager on when they think periods or openings or opportunities to fish should be. Last summer we had the most restricted. There were only 2 days to fish in the month of June, which is unheard of. The month of June is really where we have good weather, it's windy, it's hot, the blue flies aren't out, so we can put up a lot of dry fish. But now with the protections, we are switching. Most of us are now fishing for chums and reds. My kids still look through the Ziploc bag going, where are the greasy ones? Where are the oily ones? They know. It's still a painful process. One of the benefits to me of being on the salmon, being one of the salmon fellows is, and you'd think that people from the Yukon and Kuskokwim would talk to each other because we're from the YK Delta, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, but we're very, very different rivers. We don't really communicate. We have very different management systems. But I've been able to meet people from the Yukon who have explained their process has been just as tough as ours. So that's been a good learning thing for me, and I'll stop there.
All right, Ben.
Okay. Again, my name is Ben Stevens. I'm from Stevens Village. I grew up in fish camp during the month of July. Pretty much I was out there in the camp. Just to give you just a little bit of an idea of the perspective that I was asked to convey. The subsistence lifestyle, folks hear it all the time, but I think that there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding involved in that. And so I do appreciate the forum. And thank you very much for being here. the fish camp that I'm from, my family's fish camp, at one time fed between 5 and 7 families. We used that fish camp to feed up to 7 families throughout the winter. That's the basic sustenance for a large number of people from just one spot. It's a little different than the way that some folks see fish and its use. I was asked a couple of years ago to convey to another group of folks that concept, the concept of how my family is connected to the fish. And I toiled. I struggled for a number of days trying to find a way to convey this concept. And the only thing that I could come up with was that salmon equals life. Salmon equals life to our folks. And so I've been asked to convey to you some of the impacts of the declining numbers. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly shoot a few of those factors out. When our folks are disconnected from the land and the animals, it goes not only to their stomachs, but it crawls all the way back to basic human wellness. When our folks can no longer go to fish camp, they end up in cities, they end up wandering around the village with basically nothing to do. Because I think that the folks that I am from, most of their time is getting ready and doing the activities that's going to help them further down the line. And this could be different from a lot of other places. Obviously, the Kuskokwim, the Kenai, everyone's just a little bit different. I'm giving you the perspective of my little square there on the Yukon River. Now, keep in mind that the Yukon River is almost 2,000 square miles distance, covering, I believe, about 65 tribes and First Nations, going all the way back into British Columbia. And so I can only give you my little perspective there on what's considered the middle Yukon when you look at the entire river system, but upper Yukon when you draw the line, the border. And so one of the things that that we're finding is that not only are our folks spiraling out of control by their lack of opportunity, what we're finding is that reach is going way beyond what we see today, and it's going all the way back into the very fabric of our lives. And so it's a slightly different perspective than I would imagine that it is on the Kenai, where folks see fish just a little bit different. This unraveling of our basic fabric goes into a lot of different corners. It definitely impacts our sense of self-sufficiency. We can no longer go out there and for a month harvest what we're going to eat for the entire winter. We can no longer do that. That destroys something that's very core to, I believe, every human, no matter where you're from or what you do. When you can't do that, you're eating away at the very foundation on which you walk. And our folks are in the middle of that. Another thing that is really, really detrimental is one of our values, and that's the value of sharing. One of the things that we teach our young folks growing up, again, I'm just speaking from my little corner of the world, is the idea that you give away a lot of what you get. My sons, as they grow older, they start to advance. They're starting to hunt moose now. When they get their first animal, they give that thing away. It's gone. Either handing it to elders or having a great big feast and feeding a lot of people. When we're not able to do that, that also grabs at the basic foundation that my folks are built on. And when that foundation is gone, I think it leads to a lot of the insanity that we see every day now. The social ills, and so those are some of the just a few factors that I wanted to mention, that the declining numbers are negatively impacting folks that I associate with. And so I'll leave it at that. When the numbers go down, things go very badly for the folks that I know, because that fabric is coming apart. Salmon is life, not only for us, but for all of us. And I would hope that you'd pull me aside later and ask me some questions or set me straight on places where I'm not. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, so one of the things for sustainable management, whether it's in Alaska and it's salmon, could be for halibut, could be in the Gulf for red snapper, could be Atlantic cod. We have fishing communities, whether you're recreational, commercial, subsistence, and we're dependent upon fish. One of the backbones of this to do responsible management is to understand numbers and to understand the data in the fisheries research. So one of the reasons why we're talking about this is whether it's at the federal level, and Chris is looking at a 36% reduction in research monies in vessels that are going out and providing regulatory folks with the data that's necessary so that we have sustainable fisheries into the future, so we're not overfishing. So that we have some panels like this that look at how can we take the money that we do have and be more efficient and effective with it, whether it's through databases, whether it's through getting different data sets together in new and novel ways. Those are all important things. The next panel is going to talk about what we are doing when we have conservation issues. What are some ways in which we're responding? Now, one of the jobs of regulatory agencies that Chris was associated with the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, or I saw Mr. Ruffner in here, he's on the Alaska Board of Fisheries. They're allocating fish for conservation, whether it's for spawning purposes in rivers or in the ocean, but they're also allocating fish between different groups who want to use that fish. And when we have shrinking populations, it causes tensions, whether in the commercial fishing industry, between sectors within the commercial fishing industry, between recreational and commercial sectors, between different sectors within the recreational industry, between folks who have sport anglers and subsistence fishermen, between upriver and downriver subsistence communities. When you have shrinking populations of fish, how do we respond? What do we do? Sometimes that could just be regulators. We look to these boards and we say, well, you decide. And if you go to sometimes people in power, they're saying, well, we want you to come up with solutions. What are these solutions? How do we do that? And one of the ways that you can do it is you can just allocate from one group to another. You can say, you're going to get fish, you're not going to get fish. And then sometimes that will switch back and forth. One of the concepts that's being put forth is a concept called compensated reallocation, where you allow the markets instead of regulators, to look at different changes in allocations that can occur through time. And the final panel that we're going to look at is going to look at two examples of that, one with salmon and one with halibut. And with that, we go on to panel 3. Peter? Okay.
We're actually going to start with Mr. Coleman.
Okay.
Try to give you a signal. All right. Can you hear me? I'm getting this close to reading my scribble. It's hard to do all at once. I'm not real good at multitasking. Anyway, as I mentioned in the introduction, I was here to try to provide some historical context that will give you some flavor of why we asked Senator Machicki to do some work for us in the legislature. Commercial fishing in Cook Inlet, it has a long history, well over 100 years. And as a cash economy, set netters have been around in Cook Inlet since the early 1880s, so well over 130 years. As you know, early on, commercial fishing was dominated by large canneries who controlled traps. So for the spaced up and down Cook Inlet, set netters fish. Well, that's good. You don't want to know who it is anyway, right? And set netters fished in between those and around them where they weren't. And at statehood, traps were outlawed and set netters became up and down Cook Inlet, virtually from Nikiski all the way to Cape Menilchik. Drip netting became one of the user groups in the late 1940s, as I recall. In the 1970s, the limited entry fisheries program was instituted in the state of Alaska. And the premise of limited entry was to do, as the title reflects, limit participation into the fishery and assure as much as possible financial viability. And of course, we were wanting to find a way to sustain the harvest. In a set net fishery, the harvest, or the target harvest, is sockeye. And we wanted to provide for user groups and sustain harvestable levels that were beneficial to all the user groups. Taking us to where we are today, the set nets prior to the 1986-1990 period were historically a shore-based fishery, meaning that nets were adjacent to the shore and didn't extend very far from the shore, except in certain areas and a very limited basis around the mouth of the Kasilop River. There's a large tide flat that goes out much farther than the rest of the East Beach and Cook Inlet, and those fishers move their nets out to remain fishing during the tidal series. The mid-'80s brought a real big change in Cook Inlet, particularly in the set net fishery. We had the fruition of enhancement programs, which started rebuilding runs. As you may remember at statehood and beyond, we were in a rebuilding state for almost all species in Cook Inlet as a result of the use of traps and federal management there. We were in the middle of a rebuilding system that was now enhanced by aquaculture. We were having a new escapement goals that were met, that was also providing additional sockeyes into the system. We had historical high prices, which even to this day are historical. And we had areas instituted, spatial limits instituted by the Board of Fish. All those were coincidental to entice a large number of permits into our area that had not been fished there historically or traditionally. And all the available space was taken up for harvest. And our fishery virtually doubled, if not even more than that. Today's fishery doesn't support that large group. Enhancement is no longer part of the, although we hoped it would be, is not instrumental in the central district, although it is much more instrumental in the southern Cook Inlet. And changes that regulation changes have also, and historic or sockeye goals have also changed.
today to have 440 permits along the east side that many of us feel aren't sustainable. And so we have started the process to try to find a way to reduce our rates. Many people agree that that's an appropriate solution. We've had a couple of surveys that indicated support for the essential elements of a reduction in cook inlet or cook inlet set net permits. And we would like to see our fishery reduced somewhere in the range of about 45%, somewhat back to closer, but not exactly the historical footprint, but something that we believe is financially viable moving into the future. We really look forward to trying to find ways to convey fish into the river, particularly in the Chinook area. As you may know, we've had what's called the fish war along Cook Inlet for me back to 1977 when I was at the Cook Inlet Management Plan meeting that formulated that plan. When we doubled in size, we went from I say a red hot fish allocation work to a white hot fish allocation work, and we're trying to find a way to pragmatically adjust to that, convey those fish to the river, which in turn helps us satisfy management plans, provides for internal river needs, and would help us with opportunity to fish additionally, and that's financial and viability that we're looking forward to in the future. As I mentioned, we tried to go to CFPC to do what's called an optimization study, which would then show us what the number of permits, the appropriate number of permits is, but that wasn't a fruitful operation because those regulations are more suited to homogeneous groups like seiners in Southeast Alaska who move around and fish together. Much more easy to identify where reduction would take place. Cook Inlet has five different districts with 5 different set of facts, and so we've asked the senator to use his expertise and help us craft a bill that would work for those in Cook Inlet and indeed in all the Senate fisheries in the state. And so I would use that as a segue to Senator Machicki, and hopefully I haven't gone on too long.
Senator. Thank you, Ricky and Ken. So a couple of gentlemen came to me a couple of years ago and said, we have this idea, and it was about a voluntary fleet reduction, and against my better judgment, I thought I would at least take the time to evaluate the level of acceptance with SEPEC fleet. And we did that. I asked them first to pull the fleet. The KPFA board sent out a survey. I'll just give you a couple of questions. They sent out 636. At the time, they received 180 questions. They asked primarily 3. Do you support the concept of a voluntary fleet reduction program for Cook Inlet Sednet fishery? That would cost nothing to those who do not participate in marine fishing. 79.6% answered yes, 20.3% no. You support the concept of a fleet reduction program where you would be assessed 1 to 3% of the gross catch of those who chose not to participate. 85 respondents, or 48.5 answered yes, 51.5 answered no. So you're moving in the wrong direction. And then the third question, do you oppose any form of fleet reduction at this time? 82.3% said no, they do not oppose a fleet reduction. So what we learned from that is that they were interested in the discussion, didn't feel like remaining fishers, they weren't interested if they were going to have to pay for it. We brought fishing groups together. So I'm a commercial fisherman. I've been drinking since '92, and in District O, I've tried to balance the needs of all the various user groups, and we have all, which is a benefit for someone who's a senator from here, because some of the other legislative groups oppose commercial fishermen because it affects their fisheries. Some of them from other sections of the state only support commercial fisheries because that's potential solution toward reducing that conflict by reducing the east-side setback participants by about 200 permits or 45%. You know, there's been 45 years of conflict here, and really nothing has moved us forward. I agreed with the gentleman that brought it forward, and it was a group of set netters speaking to folks from river sport fishing, because I felt like it was a worthwhile discussion. What was most important to me is we put together a set of tenets and it created a voluntary fleet reduction program. It would have to remain voluntary. It would terminate when we reach the permit count of 45% or approximately 200 permits. It would set the permit value at $260,000, which is the 10-year average of catch plus year and other incidentals. We would try to bring it back to the east side set net levels of the 80s prior to the migration east. Our goal was that we would find other funding, Noaa National Private. It would not be an allocation bill, would not be used to influence allocation. So I'll talk about the bill that we have on the table right now. And the goal ultimately was a more efficient set net fishery for the 60% that chose to remain, with a likely greater return of Chinook salmon to the Kenai Sewell rivers. So ultimately, the bill that's on the table right now, Senate Bill 35 last year, and I may be going back to work on it. We're still too close to call right now, as many of you have read. But essentially, that's the bill that's on the table. It's Eastside Setnet, Cook Inlet Setnet Fleet Reduction Act. We found that there's a public interest to reduce the number of commercial setnet fishers, to allow more fish for in-river users, and create a more economically viable and sustainable setnet fishery. The Alaska Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission would have the authority through this bill to divide an existing administrative area. It would establish the Eastside Setnet Subdistrict as a distinct administrative area separate from the Inlet Central District. There would be no new entrance into this Eastside Setnet area. And essentially what we would do is it would direct the CFBC to issue new permits for that area. And we would then have the most important thing to me, after all the discussion takes place in the legislature, if the bill passes and this moves forward, is that set netters would have the final vote. At some point after passage, there would be an election process of just the east side set netters, and they would have the self-determination as to whether or not this program moves forward. The bill also defines the qualifications. That the program is voluntary. That the commission shall hold. Right now, it has a lottery each year for 3 years. That's still subject to discussion with those that are interested in the bill on how that's executed over time. The permits under this program would be canceled. The lease or body of water where that permit is fished would also be retired. And the way that I ultimately look at this is that it's a win-win, and that's sort of, if I'm going to move forward supporting something like this, it's going to be good for District O, Cook Inlet commercial fishermen. It's going to be good for the other user groups, and it's going to lead to a reduction in conflict. And I don't know that it's not something that could be used in other conflict areas. I don't know if the concept of compensated reallocation couldn't be used in the future to reduce guides if we continue to have issues with salmon returns. Other comp fisheries, Cook Inlet, other comp fisheries around the state. What I like that is that affected parties have a hands-on final vote. The reduction is completely voluntary, even for those if the vote is to pass. Obviously, the personal use fisheries, there's not a compensated solution, but that's obviously an increase in usage that's having impacts on our watershed as well. So again, I see it as a win-win. You're mutually agreed upon compensated reallocation. I can ask when we get to that point, I can answer any questions on the bill, but I really ask people to be open to the discussion. continue battle where we all mutually lose ground in a limited resource does not seem to be working. I think most of us will agree. So with an open mind perhaps and some additional amendments, others have ideas, I think it's something that we can potentially get across the finish line next week.
All right, thanks for that update on the voluntary set net buyback program. We're going to shift over to Andy Mesereau, and he's going to talk about the recreational quota entity program that passed through the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council.
Thanks, Ricky, for the welcome. I like to participate in these type of forums just because I looked around the room here and I saw maybe 15 people that routinely attend North Pacific Fishery Management Council meetings, and this kind of gives an opportunity to put out there what it is we do for 50 or 60 days a year at those meetings to people that don't normally attend them. And like I said earlier, it also gave me a chance to get off the water and go get a hamburger instead of having a sandwich again for the 50th day in a row. Anyway, what I'll do is I'll give you a quick rundown on the history of the RQE concept and then explain where we are in the process of completing the work and letting the recreational quota entity do its job. So basically, halibut is like the second ugliest and most contentious fish war in Alaska, right behind the Cook Inlet salmon issue. So I'm glad they all got to go first, and I'll take a stab at this. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to rehash the past. We've been arguing about halibut in the process since 1995, and what I want to do is just jump ahead to talk about this period that we're in and not rehash the other attempts to manage the charter sector, because I think we're in a better place from everyone's perspective now. So basically, the initial review of this recreational quota entity concept started to be developed at the council process, and at that point, the Southeast Alaska Guides Association and the Alaska Charter Association applied for and received a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to develop a concept for a market-based solution for allocation. And so while they worked on that using public testimony and a series of meetings all around the state, the council was working on a parallel track to change the management paradigm from a guideline harvest limit for the charter sector to a hard cap and indexing the charter sector to the same abundance indicators that the commercial sector had, so that the charter sector could share in the gain at times of high abundance and the pain in times of lower abundance. Of course, it's been a series of years of pain and no gain so far, but hopefully that will change at some time in the future. Basically, the catch sharing plan that did this was passed in January of 2014, and it reflected a more recent harvest level from the charter sector and, of course, allowed the allocation to fluctuate. Shortly after that, the grant recipients received completed a report that proposed a mechanism to integrate into the catch sharing program this market-based solution that would allow charter operators in Area 2C and 3A to purchase quota shares through a nonprofit entity that would be used to supplement the charter sector allocation for halibut during times of lower abundance to minimize some of the harsh restrictions that we're facing now, which include reverse slot limits and days of the week closure and annual limits, things that tend to discourage our clients from going fishing. So in October of 2014, the council authorized a recreational quota entity committee that was made up of longline industry representatives and charter operators to come up with some structure of how this might work, using the template of the report from the grant as a basis for figuring out how to do that. There were 3 meetings of this committee, and then those were all deliberated through the council process for a period of years. And in December of 2016, the council took final action on a regulatory package that allowed for the formation of this nonprofit charter halibut recreational quota entity, or RQE, to purchase and hold commercial halibut quota shares to augment the catch limits in the regulatory areas that I spoke of earlier. The council was careful to try to balance the needs of the longline sector and their concerns with the desire to have a market-based solution. And so basically, under the preferred alternative that the council passed, any IFQ annually generated from the RQE's quota share holdings would then augment the existing common pool that goes to each area of halibut, and that would be a new basis which halibut charter management limits would be established and likely reduce some of the size limits or day of the week closures over time as they purchase this quota and accumulate some. In this way, the RQE would allow for the charter halibut sector to reduce some of the restrictions on the management measures for all anglers that go on charter boats. So some of the ways that the council balanced the needs of both sectors was that they limited an annual transfer rate of 1% and 1.2% by area respectively, and a maximum transfer rate of 10% in Area 2C and 12% in 3A over the course of the life of the program that could ever be reallocated to the charter sector. In addition, there were other prohibitions like the protection of D-class quota shares for smaller vessels, and in times of higher abundance, if the RQE held quota that it couldn't use because it can only use that quota to get back to the recreational bag limit, that excess fish would be given back to the longline sector at no cost to use during those times of higher abundance, but it would only be given back to quota shareholders that held small amounts of quota, and also these community quota entities in rural Alaska. So the idea was to give the fish back to use temporarily, to give entry-level fishermen and these rural communities that have the ability to hold quota a chance to fish quota at no cost for a period of time so that they would have a leg up to buy into the fishery in some attempt to deal with the graying of the fleet and the reduction in opportunity in rural Alaska that the IFQ program kind of brought onto those communities. There's a variety of other restrictions and rules that have to be followed in there, but that's the basic overview of the RQE. It's available online if you want to read all about it. The question that came into my mind is people are sitting here wondering, why would the charter sector want to spend millions of dollars to purchase commercial quota so that their clients could then go fishing and keep the fish? And why would the commercial sector want to sell IFQ shares to their mortal enemy, the charter sector? And I think that it speaks to the value of a market-based solution with a willing buyer and a willing seller. And the alternative is uncompensated reallocation. And the National Marine Fisheries Service had a policy directive they put forward a couple of years ago that mandates allocation discussions to occur in a timely manner after a catch share plan has been put forward. And so we have a 2021 allocation review for the catch sharing plan between the longline fleet and the charter fleet. And so I think the idea was either a willing buyer could pay a willing seller for a quota share, or all of the quota shareholders could have quota removed and brought to the charter sector if an allocation fight didn't go well for the longline sector. So I think that was sort of the stick that motivated some of the longline sector to be more accepting of the concept of a market-based solution. Better to get paid for it than to have it taken away from people. And I think that was one of the reasons that got a number of the representatives in the longline sector to consider this as an option. And from the charter perspective, in Southeast Alaska, the charter fleet's being severely restricted right now. I think the bag limit is one halibut under 20 pounds or one over 200 pounds that they're allowed to keep. So essentially, it's a one fish bag limit of a 20-pound halibut that these lodges have to work with. And with the king salmon reductions, where there's no retention of king salmon in inside waters, they don't have anything to go fishing for. And so they're really in a more difficult situation than we are here. But nonetheless, I think that the idea of this sort of provides some remedy to both sides without the all-out food fight that a straight allocation battle creates. But that's not the end of the story. Where we're at now with this is that the council passed this measure. It's probably being signed into law here in the next couple of weeks if the final legal review is occurring right now. But there's no mechanism right now, no regulatory path to fund this RQE right now. And so the only options would be a private funding source that the charter fleet would seek to use to fund it, like an NGO, and bringing an NGO into a fully utilized fishery is something that definitely gives some concern to people that are already in it. And The other option would be to have some sort of a funding mechanism where all the charter fleets required to pay a specific fee based on how much halibut resource they use that would then fund that RQE. But there's about 1,500 charter businesses, and to try to get 1,500 individual businesses to voluntarily pay a certain fee every year is almost impossible. So really, the question is, at this point, who would be paying, who would manage the program, and how would the fees be collected? And so, the members of the charter fleet spoke to longline industry representatives and presented a series of options during this last winter. And I think, as one sitting council member, all of this was created in the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. The RQE program, the catch, sharing, float program, the guided halibut fleet is all managed through there, as is the longline fleet. And so it makes sense to have the North Pacific Council be able to help to develop this funding mechanism to meet the needs of the charter fleet, but also to consider the concerns of the longline fleet. And they made it clear that having the state create a stamp, like a king salmon stamp, to pay for this would be free money. There would be no effort from the charter fleet to actually pay to purchase quota, where the longliners have to buy it out of their pocket. And that argument resonated with the council that, ultimately commercial fishermen gain the revenue by selling fish. The charter fleet gains it by catching fishermen, not fish. Then the fishermen go fishing. So, ultimately our clients are going to pay for the quota, but how we do that is what really was the sticking point with the commercial sector. And they felt like they wanted to see charter operators write a check to provide the funding. And whether the charter operators choose to charge their clients or take it out of their profit from their business or pay it out of their pocket, that wasn't the argument. It was that they needed to generate a check. And so basically, the charter industry leadership looked to have the council create some kind of a program where the charter operators are individually responsible for paying for this fee each year that's going to fund the RQE, and it's based on the number of clients they take halibut fishing. The problem is the council doesn't have the authority to do that. And so what's happened now is Senator Sullivan and Murkowski have worked with the charter operators and longliners to develop some language to amend the federal law to give the council the authority to develop this funding mechanism. That's going to be voted on in Washington, D.C., hopefully at some point in the next few months. And once that happens, then the council can go about constructing this stamp program where charter operators would purchase these stamps for their clients and then collect the money back, and that's how it would work. We looked at doing it through the state, like an aquaculture cooperative. No offense to any state politicians that are here, but that process is not as familiar to the charter fleet as the federal process. That's where we've done all our other business, and we felt like going to the state might, at this particular regulatory environment where new programs are looked at with great scrutiny and old programs are being cut to balance the budget, coming in with a brand new program right now might not be met with as much support. So we opted to go to our Alaska delegation in Washington to talk about this, and they were really helpful in helping us get this right, and then met with longline industry representatives to make sure they didn't think that it was outside of being reasonable. And I'm happy to tell you at this point there was no opposition to moving this forward, considering the alternatives. And so hopefully this will get through the federal legislative process, and this whole RQE concept will become real by 2020. And by council time, that's a sprint. Things move very slowly in the council process, but I'm hopeful that that'll be the end of the RQE, and that'll sort of be the last piece of regulatory work that I do in my time on the council, which will be up in 3 years.
All right, thank you, panels. I thought hopefully everybody enjoyed panel 1 and panel 2 and panel 3. We're going to take a short time here. Chris is going to provide some closing comments and thoughts, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. Chris?
Well, do you have questions or answers? I had well, as far as some closing thoughts on my part, I just want to express my appreciation to you and the association for inviting me here. It's always good to get out of the big city of DC. We get caught up sometimes in all the stuff and hoopla going on in Washington DC and the national easy to lose sight or easy to forget about the importance of some of these more localized venues where we really drill down and talk about key issues that are locally important, locally being pretty big locally here. It's going to make the observation that if you think that Cook Inlet salmon and halibut are contentious allocations, you should come with me and roll around in Gulf of Mexico red snapper for a while. That one's pretty intense. But no, I appreciate the opportunity to come back to Alaska and see a lot of people I know and get out of the city and get back to my home. And so I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciated the presentations this morning. It was really interesting. I did have a question, follow-up question. That's all the commenting I need to do. But the question for Ken or Pete on the SetNet buyback and the funding, I think the figure was 50 or 60 million, and by the rough math in my head, maybe that comes out to $200,000 or $250,000 on average. How is that going to happen? In other words, are the remaining 55% of permit holders going to ultimately be footing that bill, or how and where? If so, how is the interim funding going to happen? How do you envision that? And I guess I'm keenly interested in what, to the extent there was some mention of a federal role in that funding process, what's the vision there?
So I'll go as far as to say that we have been visiting with our delegation in DC, who believe that they could locate and secure a major proportion of that funding at this time, and we have some private entities that are interested in partnering as well. We have no intention at this time, unless you want to guarantee, from what I can tell from our polling in our field with the fleet, that sharing the cost by the fleet would result in a no vote, and therefore would result in the absence of a reduction here on the east side. So our goal is to secure the funding, hopefully in a fell swoop, and if not, over time, which is why I left some flexibility, about a 3-year period of time, depending on how the funding was secured and how that timeline was. Thank you.
All right, do any panelists have questions for any of the presentations? Yeah.
Thank you, Ricky. I have a question about the pink salmon abundance affecting the growth rates of the Chinook salmon. And my question is, I know from my time on the North Pacific Council that Washington and Oregon put out like 250 million Chinook hatchery salmon, and then Russia and Asia put out an incredible number of chum salmon. And I'm wondering, how do you drill down to determine how the pink salmon that are put out in the hatchery systems in Alaska have a more significant impact in the size of age issue with Chinook salmon than all those other salmon that are swimming around the Gulf and the Bering Sea right along with the Chinook?
Yeah, I never made the case that it was pink salmon was any more or less of an effect than other salmon. But the odd even year patterns gives us an indication of that effect, the density dependent effect. So that unique characteristic of their life history allows us to look at this effect. And so that's why we're focusing so much on that. But yeah, certainly chum salmon are a big player in this density dependent issue. There's a billion chum salmon produced out of Japan alone. And so that's also, key part of this whole thing as well.
All right, are there questions from the audience for any of the panels that we've heard from today or for Chris Hall? Yes.
Pete, so you talked about the temperature affecting smolt. Does it also affect the mature fish in the same way?
Yeah, we've looked at that actually. We looked at the temperature effect early versus late in the life history, and we don't see a strong effect later in the history. So the temperature seems to be, at least in terms of survival, is affecting them right as they're entering as smolts into the coastal marine ecosystems.
Can you give us an idea on what that temperature fluctuation is?
It's not that much. I mean, it's a matter of just a couple of degrees centigrade. So it's relatively subtle changes, but it's having a more kind of pronounced effect on food web and the prey composition of basically the zooplankton that the fish are feeding on when they first enter the ocean. So it's not a dramatic in terms of absolute temperature change.
You got a question in the back? In the far back? Yes.
Thanks. Bob Shavis, I just want to thank you, Ricky, and Chris for putting this on. Really valuable information and analysts. I heard a lot of things about the ocean, but I didn't hear anything about winter habitat or coastal habitat. You know, it's great right now going on the domination with the Stanford Sound initiative and $10 million coming from the other side when they push that down. Our habitat law is about 60 years old. The about 1 sentence long, and it was a great example recently on the Noaa River near the Flowers where someone was doing a gravel pit, and it wasn't in the middle of the river, so it's all 16 didn't apply. It was within 50 feet, so the Noaa River ordinance didn't apply, and it was only dredgingable wetland, not the flowing river, so they're only put in that jurisdiction. So my question for everybody is anybody looking at habitat? You know, scientific studies are looking at habitat and implications for salmon survivorship around spawning beds.
I am just about to start a research project that's going to look at, it's a comparative study between the lower Pacific Northwest, Washington and Oregon, and their regulations and ours. So their regulations in the 70s and 80s, comparing them to the regulations that we have today to see where we are at in terms of salmon protection. But that, I can talk to you more about that later, but the gist is to my hypothesis is that our regulations are about where they were at in the 1970s and 80s. And what does that mean for our salmon population?
All right, further questions? Yes, in the back.
So, Megan, when you're collecting your data, are you looking to ever add any economic impact data to the board of fish decisions, whether how it affects say, economy here in Kenai or the commercial effects in Kenai based on board of fish regulations?
So the data that we have in this first data set are proposals. And one of the researchers on SAFEP is, his name's Tobias, and he's with ICER. And so I have begun discussions with folks at ICER to do a comparative study with economic data on board of fish decisions. It's pretty tricky because it was very difficult in the data set to get to a decision because of the tabling and something was brought up in the fall and then was tabled and then it comes in the spring. So just getting to that decision point has been very difficult. And so that's kind of the first hurdle in looking at economic implications, is figuring out what was actually done. And so once we kind of get over that hurdle, I think we can start looking at some economic analysis.
Yes, in front.
I thought it was great that you have representatives of really all the fishing ways. You have sport fishermen, commercial fishermen, east side set netters, the charter fishermen, and for halibut and so on, and longliners. But I really don't know, really no one's talked about the trawlers that are out in the ocean, what effect they're having on our fishing, and what we can do about limiting that, or I'd like to hear what y'all think about that, what that component of our.
So there's two people up here with intimate knowledge of that. Chris or Andy, would you guys like to take a shot at? I mean, so 95% of the time, what the council does is deal with those issues and not the habitat issues. So if you guys want to talk about it.
I can take a stab at it. It's a good question. I think it's only human nature to look at another sector that we don't know that much about and look to see how responsible they are for, say, declining salmon runs. And I can tell you that there's certainly been an effort to get the best observation possible on the trawl fleet in the Bering Sea. The trawl fleet in the Gulf does not have the best level of observer coverage. And a lot of that just has to, that does not have the optimal level of observer coverage. And I think the way to deal with salmon bycatch or halibut bycatch is to properly observe the fleet. And presently we had an opportunity to rationalize the Gulf trawl fleet a couple of years ago at the council, and we missed the mark on it. We couldn't reach a consensus on the best way to do that. And I think that the only way that we can deal with the bycatch issue is to understand how much it really is, and to get better observer coverage. And just like there isn't enough money for science, the agency doesn't really have enough money to put 100% observer coverage on. The industry has to pay for it, and that rate's like $900 a day right now. And so the only way they can do that is if we privatize their catch, so they can use that equity to offset some of the costs associated with it. And the council is just not there yet. I think it will come, and it will help. But ultimately, I guess from a manager's perspective, the trawl fleet's been operating in the way that it's been operating for many years, through good times and bad times of salmon abundance. And while it's important to get observer coverage on those vessels to know exactly what they're catching all the time, if their impacts were a cause of this, we would have seen a decline a long time ago when there was little observer coverage or none on that fleet. And so what I look at is what's changed in the world that's during the same time that these conditions with salmon have changed. And what's changed in the world is the ocean temperatures and the productivity of the ocean and the ocean conditions. That's the one thing that we know has changed. And I think it's important to minimize bycatch as much as possible, get proper observation on there, but it's a federal process and it takes years to do it. And we'll get there. It's getting better every year, a little bit incrementally better, but it's a balancing act between the community of Kodiak and their financial need with the trawl fleet and the commercial fishing industry that depends on salmon and recreational fleet. And it crosses jurisdictions and boundaries, and I think everyone's working towards getting better data, but that's going to be the first step to control what they're catching.
All right, final question, Paul.
The final question.
Yeah.
Well, like others have said, thank you very much for this roundtable discussion. It was interesting, and it was informative. Best roundtable I've ever attended. Final question is for you, Ricky. I am, like most commercial fishermen, thrilled at the prospect of getting a portion of salmon in the Kenai River and not causing us problems with sockeye harvest. I am interested in your organization's view of that benefit from a setnet buyback, because I suspect your organization's view of that is going to be part and parcel of that success. So on a scale from ambivalence to full support, where is your organization's perception of that? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul. Great question. So we had a planning session last year, and we had, we were going to focus on 3 priorities. And one of those priorities, the first one was this setnet initiative, to work with the setnet community, through the folks who reached out to us with Tim and Ken and the Salmon Association that was formed, and to work with Senator Berchicki on looking at all the variables. Its primary impact is on the setnet community, and what we've told Ken and the Senator and Tim and anybody else is where we can assist, we'll do that. And it's on the agenda right here because of that commitment to do that. So we figure that the more we can educate people about this issue and try and get all different viewpoints incorporated into it, so it becomes a non-controversial issue both within the angling community and within the setnet community, and we can try and come to a consensus to move that forward. That's what our commitment is to do.
Thank you.
So that wraps up our roundtable for this year. The slideshow will be available on our website. We'll put that on up, and We appreciate the attendance, the folks here. We'll be here for the next 15 minutes, a half hour. If you have questions, please come on up and ask them individually. Thank you so much for attending, and we appreciate the support for attending here. Thank you very much.
There you go.